Hey all, I apologize that I can't be here today. I really would like to, and I know I've missed a lot of AP classes lately for tennis, but I just became a godfather yesterday in the cities, and I just could not make it back on time. So I apologize, and to hopefully make it up for you, there's a video here that kind of goes over today's topic. I'm going to try and keep it as brief as I can to help you guys get going with your assignment right away. Today's topic is political socialization. What is it, and how does it work? And before we start talking about political socialization, I kind of want to tell you guys a story. Now, back in the day, there was this dude named Ptolemy the First. And Ptolemy the First was one of the generals of Alexander the Great. And after Alexander the Great's death, he gained control of Egypt. And when he went to Egypt, he wanted to convert the local people to his new god. It was a god that worshipped the sun. And so he built this grand temple called the Serapeum of Alexandria. And throughout ancient history, the Serapeum of Alexandria was a huge attraction for people all over Europe to go and to take a look at A, its architectural beauty, but B, some of the weird, strange things that happened there. Many historians from the Greek period talked about seeing two statues that would move together without prompting. In fact, it was so famous that people traveled to Alexandria to get married in the Serapeum because they saw this as a religious omen for a marriage. But more interestingly, one day of the year, every single year, on the feast of this particular god, in the Serapeum, they would bring in a large iron ball, and they would bring it to a particular hallway in the Serapeum, and a priest would say words, and the ball would float up into the air on its own. And this stunned and amazed people from all across Europe, including most particularly Pliny the Elder, who's this main source that we have for this. And for years upon years, people were like, we don't quite buy this story. Pliny was a well-known BSer, and for most of the people in the world, they thought, it's just a story of the ancient world. And then a while back, they started excavating the Serapeum of Alexandria. And lo and behold, what did they find in this temple? They found that the material they made was exceptionally magnetic, had an incredibly strong magnetic pull, particularly in the statues and in that hallway. And so the entire time, there was no magic, there was no gods at work, there was just magnetism. And if you asked Ptolemy, hey, how does this work? He would have never been able to explain to you the ins and outs of magnetism. But he knew it worked. And he knew people loved it. And he knew people came from all across Europe to see it. He didn't have to understand how magnetism worked, to knew that it worked for him when he needed it. So one of the questions to think about with political socialization is, if something works reliably well, is it a big deal if we don't perfectly understand why or how? And I'm going to come back to that question later. Political socialization is the complex process in which people acquire their political values. You start as a blank state, and over time you do acquire an ideology. Perhaps you acquire an ideology that's conservative, perhaps you find one that's liberal, or perhaps you have an ideology that's generally apathetic. And political socialization is, how did you gain that particular ideology? And yes, it does matter for apathy as well too. And there are two things to take a look at when we think about political socialization. They're psychological factors. Number one is primacy. The primacy principle says whatever is learned first is always learned best. And the second thing is that what is learned first structures later learning. So the things that you learn from a very young age will affect your political socialization most likely the strongest, and will structure your learning for the future. You will use your earlier experiences and beliefs to structure the way you see politics now. So one of the things we know about it is that it starts from a very early age. So what are some of the factors that influence your political socialization? We'll see them right here. Family, school, education level, peer groups, income, and region are some of the ones that I have on this particular slide, but there's others as well as, say, ethnicity, race, religion. Now, the one that I want to talk about the most is family, because family comes first in the realm of political socialization. There have been many different studies that have shown that the number one influence on your values is your family, and the only thing actually that correlates more strongly between parents and children than politics and ideologies is religion. Now you might be sitting there going, hold up, I don't agree with my parents on politics. That's fine, but your family has an impact on your political socialization because the things that you learn from them structured various ways of thinking. And you guys are all teenagers, and at this point you probably begin to start thinking for yourself in many meaningful ways. But even though you're branching out and breaking out and thinking in different ways, you're still structuring that based off the values that your family taught you. So even if your family's not talking politics, they're instilling particular values in you, things like hard work, or equality, or fairness, or trying to do the right thing for others. Or they might be instilling you the idea that, hey, it's not a fair world out there and you need to get what you earn. These things are all possibly available to literally any single family and kid and affect their political socialization in the future. School is also another incredibly important one because school is a tool of socialization in general. From a very young age, you're taught about how great America is, and that's the best country in the world, and you'll get up and you'll say the Pledge of Allegiance and you'll love Christopher Columbus. And then later, that still acts as structured learning. You might start thinking about, okay, well, maybe Columbus, I've heard these things, maybe he's not such a great guy, and this leads you to think in a different way. So family and school are two of the most prime levels of socialization that structure your thinking later, even if you disagree with your family or your school. Some other ones here that are relatively important as well are a little bit more obvious. You act and think like your peer groups. The amount of money you have reflects how you feel about social programs. If you grew up poor and you needed food stamps to make things work, well, then you love those types of programs because you've seen their impact. Whereas if you grow up with a little bit more money, you might not appreciate the value of those and might instead think about how it takes money out of your pocket via taxes. Region's another incredibly important one, and it's not just region and area like the United States, it's also urban versus rural. If you take a look at this picture here, it's the 2016 electoral map by counties, and you can see that even in red states, for example, let's have a look at Minnesota. There's one blue county here, that's Minneapolis. Look in Wisconsin, we got Milwaukee and we got Madison. Chicago, we have all these big cities that reflect more liberal values, and this is kind of an interesting thing because it's not just about the region you're in. Even in very red regions, it might just be whether you live in a city or not. And so there's a bunch of different factors of region that go into your socialization as well. What I'd like to show you guys here too, really quickly, is I want to talk about this idea. How can a farmer in North Dakota who's staunchly conservative, opposes welfare programs, and stresses the value of hard work, also love his farm subsidies? Well, there's another idea that goes into politics called the self-interest principle, which believes that a lot of times people vote for what benefits them personally. And if you look at the map down here in the corner, you might see that North Dakota gets quite a few farm subsidies. I personally know farmers that will tell you that welfare is the most destructive thing in American society, but at the same time will take their gigantic farm subsidy when they've had a bad year. Perhaps their ideologies aren't that important, and their political socialization has to do more with self-interest in what's good for them. There's an old saying that says, people vote with their wallets. Perhaps this is a huge part of socialization. However, this doesn't explain the following chart. In the LA Times in 2016 did a huge survey. They asked over 1,000 people to answer these questions, and they found that people below the poverty level have an equal chance of believing that that welfare programs help them get started again and encourage people to stay poor. And if the self-interest principle is in play, wouldn't this number be much, much higher than this number? Perhaps self-interest doesn't explain everything. And so what I want to point out as well is that don't get caught up believing that people vote with only their wallets. Self-interest cannot and should not explain all political behavior because there are too many examples of that not working, where people's ideologies supersede their self-interest. So keep the self-interest principle in mind, but also understand that it can't explain all types of political behavior. The last chart I'd like you guys to look at is what type of demographic information correlates with a person's ideology. And this is where I want to go back to Ptolemy, the Serapeum of Alexandria, and our floating rocks. Ptolemy didn't have to understand how it worked. He couldn't reproduce it or break it down in a different scenario. He just knew that in general in this corridor we could make this rock float. It's similar here. Political scientists look at this type of information and they use this to predict elections. They use this to win elections. They use this to manage elections, and different political parties use this data to appeal to their voters. You're darn right the Republican Party knows that evangelicals in general have a 58-point Republican lead, and they will use targeted ads to bring evangelicals to the polls because they know those are their voters. The Democrats at the same time, look at this, they have a 76-point lead. And by the way, all of this information comes from the Pew Research Group. It's a 3,000 person study. It's one of the best, most comprehensive studies on ideology you can find anywhere. Now you might be sitting there going, hold up, I'm a white male, but I lean Democratic. And that's fine, that's great, because this stuff right here it shouldn't be used to put anyone in a box. I can't walk up to a person 65 and older and be like, yep, Republican, I can tell. Because that doesn't apply to everyone. You could fit all the boxes on the Republican side and be Democrat. You can fit all the boxes on the Democratic side and be Republican. These are general trends that give political scientists, campaign managers, and other individuals an idea of where people are at in general. I will tell you right now that the Democratic Party in the midterms right now is working to get Asian, Hispanic, and African American voters voting as much as physically possible because they know that helps them win elections. And so yes, We can't take every single person, and we can't sit there and go, an African American will 100% vote Democratic, because we know that's not right. But we do know that in general, about there's a 76-point lead for Democrats in that particular party. And I can say with confidence that if African American voter turnout is high, it's going to be a pretty good midterm election for the Democrats. So again, I don't exactly know how political socialization works 100% because nobody does. We can't sit there and say, okay, we have such and such right here, and he fits this box, and this box, and this box, and this box. He should be a Democrat, when in fact he's a Republican. It doesn't always work for every single person, but it gives us a reliable trend that we can use and a baseline that we can expect, which is what makes these types of things useful for political scientists.